Wednesday lunch here at the Divinity School. I'm Taryn Wine. I'm the Director of Communications here. I organize this series, so it's my pleasure to see you all here today. Before we get started, I just want to do a couple quick announcements and a little housekeeping. So most importantly, if you don't know, this meal was cooked today from scratch by some of our students who are now hiding in back. Our chefs today were Dahlia and Tori, and we also have other students who helped create this meal, and it's so nice. To cook a meal, have to clean it, all those things. But we do ask you to clean up after yourselves on your way out. We are now composting the leftovers, so if you could put whatever your leftovers are into that white tube thing, bucket, and then next to it is our famous yellow soapy vat. That's for your utensils. And throw your plates away. That really just helps us get out of here on time. I also want to ask you to turn off your cell phone ringers before we get started. I'd like to let you know that we are hiring. If you're a student and this looks like a fun job, which it is, and you like eating leftovers because they're free, those are all good perks of this job, so you can talk to me afterwards if you feel like maybe you enjoy washing dishes or setting tables. And having fun with the students who already work here. So, I want to mention that on Saturday, we are co-hosting a movie that's going to be at Doc Films at 2 o'clock called Chosen. There's a poster out about it, and it will be in our next email. If you're not getting our emails about all of our public events, please see me right afterwards so I can add you to that so you can learn about things like this movie and our upcoming conferences. And next week's lunch, where we're going to have a Dean's Forum with one of our professors, Alireza Dustar, who's written a book called The Iranian Metaphysicals, and he's going to have comments from some other professors. It's also Halloween, so I feel like this is the perfect confluence of things. Anybody who comes in costume next week will have my everlasting gratitude for not making me the only one. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guests for today, but our speakers for today, who are two of our own professors. I want to let you know that next month, on November 7th through 9th, the Marty Center will be hosting a conference called Political Theology, Promise and Prospects, and our speakers for today are giving us some advanced discussion on this topic. So our speakers for today are Professors Dwight Hopkins and Willemien Otten. Dwight Hopkins is the Alexander Campbell Professor here in the Divinity School. He's a constructive theologian, working in the areas of contemporary models of theology, various forms of liberation theologies, and East-West cross-cultural comparisons. Professor Hopkins is interested in multidisciplinary approaches to the academic study of religious thought, especially cultural, political, economic, and interpretive methods. Willemien Otten is Professor of Theology and the History of Christianity. She's also the director of our Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion. She studies the history of Christianity and Christian thought with a focus on the medieval and early Christian intellectual tradition and an emphasis on the continuity of Platonic themes. So, as I said, they're going to speak about this conference and political theology, so please just join me in welcoming first Professor Otten. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today for this. So I want to say a little bit about the conference that I co-organized with Professor Ryan Coyne and Yusuf Casewit. And then I'll say a little bit about the background, why we did it the way we did, a little bit about political theology, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Hopkins, whom you heard with his background in constructive theology, liberation theology, is really more the kind of material expert on political theology. But let me say a little bit about the conference. When I became director of the Marty Center, I said to Dean Zola at the time that I would like to do two things. On one hand, I would like to do sort of public events and increase the visibility of the center. But I also said I wanted us to not just exhaust ourselves through these public events, but also be nourished in a way academically by doing some conferences. I know not everybody loves conferences, but I do. And I actually was thinking about that this morning. I think It's been one of my frustrations, I feel, at the div school, that we are a very good place. We have very good people, but that's why we feel we don't need to invite anybody else. And I sort of feel, I remember as a student that we had a conference and some scholars from England would come, and it was just a big event, and it really helped shape my thoughts. So I really felt that we could do some more conferences, especially also to expose students to different kinds of thought. So I really have you all as students in the school also in mind, to be able to really see someone like Jeff Stout, who will be our opening speaker, see how he works through a problem. As I told Dean Zolo, I wanted to do these conferences, and then political theology came to mind for various reasons. One was that in the last 5 to 10 years, we hired a number of faculty through so-called expansion, through the expansion program that the university started. We hired Professor Krause in Byzantine theology and Professor Fredericks in environmental ethics. We also put in, at the time, a hire in political theology. We were not given that line, so we don't have anyone whose job description is really political theology. We have Professor Hopkins who can cover, but we didn't get that line. But it always stuck with me that it was an important area to think about. There was also a biography that was just published last year by Robert Lerner at Northwestern University, a medieval historian, on Kantorowicz. And Kantorowicz is a very famous Jewish-German thinker who wrote a book, The King's Two Bodies, which has been influential in medieval politics. And it deals, the King's Two Bodies deals with the idea that the king has his own physical body, but the realm is also his body. So that's why you say the king is dead, long live the king, because the realm continues. So it was on my mind, and I just thought that would be a great topic. So I sat down with the help of Professor Coyne and Professor Casewicz and sort of mapped out what we wanted to do. I can tell you, organizing a conference is not easy, because you would think if you invite scholars, you say, we'll pay your way, can you please come? They would jump at the chance, but some people said, well, no, we're on sabbatical, we don't really want to be disturbed. So it was actually quite a bit of work to get the people also really want it. But we're very happy actually with the final lineup. And I wanted to make sure that it wouldn't be an exclusively Christian affair, right? So we are very happy with a couple of Islamic sessions that we have. Professor Casewicz has been enormously helpful. We have a few sessions on Black theology on Friday, on Latin American theology. Of course, it could be more ideal. We have not included Hinduism, Buddhism, so it's imperfect. We need to have more conferences. That's sort of the message. But we're happy with what we have, and we hope you will enjoy it. And now a little bit about what political theology then stands for. You may be familiar with two names that I'm going to mention, Carl Schmitt and Giorgio Agamben. And both have dominated the fields of political theology. And I'll say a little bit about them, but we have decided that we don't want to be dominated in that way. So we actually deliberately want to do something else. I'm sure their names will come up and will play a role, but we don't want to sort of fall into that trap and just continue a discourse that's been started and just keeps going without, and that way can actually stifle creative thought. So Carl Schmitt, who lived from 1888 to 1985, was a conservative German legal, constitutional, and political theorist who's often considered to be one of the most important critics of liberalism, parliamentary democracy, and liberal cosmopolitanism. You actually hear some echoes of debates and criticism that go on today. He became affiliated with the National Socialist regime in Germany, but he wrote a book, Concepts of Political Theology, in which he kind of coins that term to focus on the sovereignty of the ruler, and basically sketches that out in political terms, in theological terms rather, and so feels that the rule of the sovereign is more important than the rule of law, because in the end, it's sort of where the buck stops. Is for him is not the law, but the sovereign who kind of embodies the law. Of course, if you think of the despotism of Nazi Germany, that's all kind of scary. And I am very critical of Schmitt, and I'm not sure that for various reasons, I really don't want him to dominate the discussion on political theology, but he really does. And he has obviously good insights, and one of his insights is, and that's what he argues in political theology, that all key concepts of the modern doctrine of the state are secularized theological concepts. So, and that suggests that a political theory that continues to use these concepts needs a theological foundation. And that's his notion that you're either a friend or an enemy, and that in the end it's the sovereign who kind of embodies the state. I mean, if you think of sort of the discussion surrounding Kavanaugh, that, you know, the executive president can in the end maybe not be criticized or held accountable, there are certainly ramifications of his thought. Agamben then is the second person I want to mention. And Agamben has written a lot of things, also retrieving a lot of sort of theological concepts like sacrament, but built on the thought of Schmitt in the sense that, and this was very relevant also after 9/11, that he focuses on the state of exception, that governments, when they are in crisis, can call for a state of exception, which actually increases the rule of the president or whatever, the autocrat who's in charge. And he has criticized that. He has criticized the sort of biopolitical power in a Foucauldian sense that the modern state has over its subjects. Both Schmitt and Agamben, and I would say Agamben is a little more subtle, are very important and retrieve kind of theological concepts. But what is, I find a little sad to some extent, is that they retrieve these concepts without the background in the theological tradition that these concepts have. And so the way we want to go about the conference is more along the lines of the political theology network that has been started some years ago. There's now also a set of political theology groups at the AER. They had an inaugural meeting last year. And let me just read what the Political Theology Network, which has a website, says about itself. It says the Political Theology Network aims to be a hub for exploring the intersection of religious and political ideas and practices. The network is interdisciplinary, publicly engaged, and committed to building links between theologians, practitioners, and humanities scholars. Riding a wave of scholarly interest in political theology that itself follows the increasing visibility of religion in public life, the network seeks to create the infrastructure that will allow this interest to flourish in the long term, supporting discussions of political theology in the classroom, in scholarly research, and in the public arena. By bringing scholars thinking with the term political theology from throughout the humanities together with scholars of religious traditions, so that's the change, you know, from Agamben and Schmitt, that this really wants to concentrate it also in the various religious traditions. We aim to thicken the appreciation of religion's complexity among the former while sharpening the critical edge of the latter. So the former would be the humanities, and sharpening the critical edge of the latter would be the religious traditions. So just like the Political Theology Network, we're not going to get around Schmitt and Agamben completely, but we can enrich what they do and embed it in the resources that the study of religion here and in other institutions has had for years. The Political Theology Network has also been supported by a major grant from the Luce Foundation, And one of its founders is going to be here, and that's actually Vincent Lloyd, who published the book, The Problem with Grace, Reconfiguring Political Theology, in which he actually says that he wants to explicitly retrieve theological terminology like grace, but law and other, and move away from the kind of secularized notion of theology that you get in Schmidt that then becomes normative for religious discussion. So we want to go back to the religious discussion and have that be normative. I think I'll now turn it over to Professor Hopkins, but just make one additional comment. So we got some support, and that's actually really nice, from the Lumen Christi Institute. And Thomas Levergood said to me what he wanted to do, or he thought was nice, was to give out scholarships to students. So we advertised the program through the Political Theology Network. We had 17 applications, and we were able to give scholarship to 7 students who will all attend from other institutions. So there are people from Emory, Villanova, I think Duke, one from Oxford, but there will be 7 students in a doctoral program elsewhere who specifically will come to be at this conference. So I actually thought that was a very nice gesture, and it speaks to the point of the conference to really sort of spread the word and continue scholarship in this area. And now the real expert in this area is Professor Hopkins.
Good afternoon. It's good to see you all here. I will be brief because we're just a tease. We're the promo. Pardon? What? No, I mean, this is, we're teasing you to come to the conference. I'm not a tease. I'm keeping my clothes on. Keeping my theological clothes on. So as Professor Otten mentioned, there are various strands of political theology, and of course it depends on how you define it and how you feel comfortable both as a person and as a scholar. Many of you know that there was a cultural movement in the United States in since World War II, right? Bubbled up, began to explode in the 50s, and then really we had a major cultural shift in the United States during the 60s and 70s, depending on your perspective, if it's good, bad, or indifferent. And a lot of us understand political theology, at least in the U.S. context, as emerging from that historical period, that economic, political, and cultural period. So for some of us, political theology is that political theology. But I also want to say that to me, I'm a both and person, both as an individual and as a scholar, so I enjoy the proliferation of all types of political theology. I do think that I will repeat some of the points that Professor Otten mentioned about theology and her perspective. I resonate deeply, not only because I agree with her on many things, but also I think it's just the reality. So again, hope you will come November 7th, 8th, and 9th to the conference sponsored by the Marty Center on political theology. One of the areas where political theology flourished in the 1950s and 60s, post-World War II, was Black liberation theology. Now, but we also have to contextualize Black liberation theology within the larger political theological movement globally. Many people don't realize that in the early 1960s, liberation theologies, plural, were emerging all over, independent of each other. And some would call it a miracle, some would be an act of history. They didn't know each other. Many people didn't speak other languages. For example, Cohen didn't speak Spanish, so there was no contact with people in Latin America and other places. But Black liberation theology as an indigenous American form of political theology has to be contextualized, not as some uniqueness that is not linked to reality, but as something that is particular, but also linked to a larger universal movement of global political theology, which some have termed liberation theologies, plural. Also during that movement, so one, context is very important when we talk about political theology. So to hear the context that Professor Otten mentioned with Professor Schmidt, for us as liberation political theology, is so cardinal. How does one grasp one's theology without understanding or being enlightened by the context out of which it came. Context does not always control the conclusions of theology, but there is, to me, an interplay, a dialectical relation between the rise of political theology as theology on the one hand, and on the other, the context out of which it comes. Because for me, ideas emerge from below. And so, again, the context of Black liberation theology as a political theology in indigenous to the United States emerges in this larger global movement in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so what does it mean? It means that from the perspective of this form of political theology, liberation theologies, and Black liberation theology, in that all theologies and the doing of theology or God talk are inherently political. Now, by political, it means, and we mean in this context, that in order to understand folks' God talk or God walk or God philosophizing, whatever you want to call it, it has to be linked to a larger context of politics and economics and culture. So in a sense, if you trace the economics and political strings, you get a good sense from this perspective of what the theology is about. And it's not saying that, it's not making a judgmental statement, it's actually just sort of making a phenomenology statement. You look at the phenomenon itself, it does have a moral critique and theological imperative, but at first it analyzes all theologies and comes up with the conclusion that all theologies are inherently political. That is to say, they operate in relationship to larger economic, political, and cultural dimensions. It's not to question necessarily at this stage the motivations of the scholar or a movement or a tradition. It's mainly to see that if we analyze the situation of the theology, we come up with this context, and the strands of that context are determined by politics, economics, and culture. So that's broadly construed how we would understand political theology. What you can see is a little different from Professor Smith's understanding and others who you hear about at the conference. So November 7th, 8th, and 9th, we're having a conference. Don't come for me, I'm just coming there just to learn a lot. So what does that mean? Well, for example, if we understand political theology as being involved, linked in a particular context, linked to culture, politics, and economics, Black liberation theology would be a good example of that. And as many of you know, Black liberation theology begins in the 60s. Many folks think it began with Professor James H. Cone, who passed in the spring at Union Theological Seminary there. And he's often claimed to be the father and founder of Black liberation theology as an indigenous American contextual theology and political theology, which is true. But we have to go back to the people who initiated the discussion about Black liberation theology. And they were indeed 47 Black male pastors and one female pastor. I call them 47 plus 1. There were no academics involved in the founding of Black liberation theology initially. They were all church leaders and pastors. For example, many of you might know about the Black Power statement. Well, it was issued on June 16, 1966 in Greenwood, Mississippi. It was one of those typical civil rights movement led by Dr. King and the youth students. You know, you've probably seen either Hollywood versions or you've seen the 16 hours of Eyes on the Prize, which is, they went through the archives and had if you want to see the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement in living color, literally, they went through all from Mississippi to Berkeley, 14 hours. It's awesome. I teach a course, they use 14 hours. But anyhow, so whatever way you've gotten to know about the civil rights of Black Power movement, you sort of have a sense, right? Well, specifically on this particular July 16, 1966 Greenwood, Mississippi March, the march was co-led by Dr. Martin King Jr., PhD at Boston University, systematic theology. You know who Dr. King is, and Stokely Carmichael, who was the head of the youth wing of the civil rights movement. So they were like the sharp troops. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was the name of the group. Nonviolent, obviously, right, indicates that these young people in their teens and early 20s supported immigration, they supported turning the other cheek, they supported the Martin Luther King movement. But on this particular march, Stokely Carmichael, who was the co-leader with King, was jailed all the time in these marches. You know, Hollywood does not do justice to those marches. But anyhow, so he was released. And the march goes on, you get jail in Macomb, you get out, you catch up on the you get jailed again, you catch up in Mississippi. So anyway, he caught up with the march, he's a co-leader of it. And he gave a speech on a big flatbed church truck one Sunday, June 16th, and he said, you know, I'm tired of going to jail. What we need is black power. So that literally is the beginning of the black power movement. And it emerges out of, in relationship to, a Christian civil rights movement. A lot of people see black power as primarily Malcolm X. It is, in fact, the student nonviolent court community, young people, were termed the angry children of Malcolm X. This is June 16, 1966. Malcolm X was assassinated February 21st on a ball in 1965 in Harlem. So this like 18 months later, but nonetheless, it emerges out of the civil rights movement. It emerges out of a nonviolent Christian discourse and movement of Dr. King and his generation. So what are we saying? We're saying that on June 16th, this call of black power goes out, and if you were alive, it pretty much sort of split all of America, certain parts, you know, because people were used to King, who was a theologian, who was a pastor, who understands civil rights, who understands the language, you know, he has a philosophy, so he understands Augustine. He teaches courses on Augustine and Morehouse. I mean, there's a whole academic realm that people don't realize about King, who was trained as a philosophical, systematic, constructive theologian in the Western tradition. He would not have studied many Negroes back in that day, that generation. They would be, you know, you see a Charles Long here would be an example, or Nathan Scott, two black faculty there, trained in classic Western tradition. So all we're saying is that, you know, this black power movement emerged out of a Kingian movement, which was defined by the larger Western discourse, theological and Christian faith discourse. So what happens is, America split as a result of this eruption of black power. International press were there, so it went global immediately, not so much as Twitter and all we have, but in our day, with 3 reporters on television. The television went off at 11 o'clock. When you went to sleep, and the television came on at 7 o'clock in the morning. So it took 10 days for your mail to come, so I'm not reminiscing. But it was a different context, a different generation. And so what happens is that black pastors were asked to respond to this new development. And so on July 31st, June 16th, right, stop the car, July 31st, the Ad Hoc National Committee of Negro Church Men wrote a New York Times full spread statement called Black Power in Response. And in that statement, they not only do they not oppose black power, they support black power. And this is a huge divide in American reality, the church in particular, but the academy also, because these were lieutenants of Martin Luther King. Can you imagine? And so they were more or less seen as sort of crazy betrayal. You know, they went to summer camp with their white colleagues, United Methodist Church and United Church of Christ, and now they come out, you know, wow, you supporting black power. And it's like, you supporting us out a lot, you know. I mean, it was wow, black power in certain cases were seen like that. So what are we saying? So they are the beginners, the 47+1, the Ad Hoc National Committee of Negro Church Men, 47 men plus 1 woman, and a hedgeman, who initially give rise to this phenomenon called black liberation theology. And then the academics began to infuse into the movement in 69, 68, 60, well, they began to write about it. And so Campbell writes the first book on black liberation theology, Black Theology and Black Power, March of 1969. And if you look in that book, particularly chapter 2, he's developing the whole liberation theology as an explicit political theology. And so 69, Cone writes the first book. 1970, his second book comes out, A Black Liberation Theology. It's all political theology. And in the third book, Gustavo Gutierrez publishes his book in Spanish in 1971, and then Orber's book translations in 1973. Now, I always put that out there because I have gone to a lot of global, I've been attacked globally for that statement, but mainly by Americans who are one of these liberation theology conferences globally. They wouldn't attack me here because there's some things we at home. But that's the emergence of black liberation theology as a form and part of the global liberation theology in relation to the notion of political theology. And so it comes out of people's movements, it comes out of practitioners who are leaders. It is joined hand in hand by academics, that in a sense people who are formally trained to do this type of, as we say here, discourse. So it has a context, it emerges from below, as we say. It also has a deep rootedness in traditions. Some even call James Cone as a child of Karl Barth, particularly his first book and then the second book. So, and Cone did a MA and a PhD on Karl Barth, theological anthropology at Northwestern Garrett. So, and maybe that's some, so that's the tradition, right? There are other traditions that comes with, obviously, slave narratives, African American, black women's, but the larger tradition of Christianity can be found within and infusing, if not, in fact, impacts black liberation theology. So it is linked to traditions. It's also linked to a political theological interpretation of the Bible. And the classic pericopes, if you will, always, well, the first one is that the claim of black liberation theology as a political theology is to say, in fact, the Christian understanding, which we call the Old Testament, I always put that out there, we call it the Old Testament, claims that the Old Testament is glued by a narrative of people who were materially enslaved. They were literally slaves who were whipped and beaten and didn't have food and everything we think about slavery. So political theology would say, well, if we look at not only tradition, but also we look at the source of biblical writ, it is bubbling with politics. And I'm sort of amplifying how, I don't agree at all about amplifying how political theologians black would say, well, of course, look at the entire Old Testament. It is about people being freed, right? It's about people who were physically enslaved. It's about a political God who felt compassion, not for the big house, which personally I think God is for all people, but not feel compassion. This God felt, Yahweh felt compassion for poor, who were literally slaves. So once if you go hooked that way, you can follow the rest of it. So if you don't follow that, there may be some questions about this one, black theology or political theology. So that's one use of the biblical tradition. The other is that there are also these classic sort of pericopes that we use. If you take my classes, we talk about this more in depth. But one would be in Luke chapter 4, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. For those who have read it, either as practitioners or just as literature, like Shakespeare's literature. But there, this is the first public announcement of Jesus on earth, and he chooses Isaiah. He's not choosing, he was given the text of Isaiah 61. And that whole speech, that is the first public speech of Christians' Lord and Savior or object of study, that talks about liberation of the poor. And so that's also a classic text linked to the particular reading of the Old Testament, Luke 4, etc. And then also Mary Magnificat's in Luke 4 too. So, and then the other text is Matthew 25, 31 and following. I think it's the so-called sheep and goat. So those of you who read the literature, Jesus is making a judgment of all of creation. It doesn't say anything about churches, interesting enough. And then those who go into a happy life for the rest of their being are the ones who practice liberation of the poor. So clearly, these two pericopes are very powerful, and they germinate political theology, black liberation theology as a political theology. So subsequently, we would also include Womanist theology, and we teach a course on that. Sometimes we co-teach it, but it talks about how African American women celebrate and enjoy their positive relationship with the divine, and various sources they draw on for their political theology. So they're much more broad than the black liberation theology, at least the first generation of Cone, because they look at the total way of life. They deal with environment as a celebration of joy. They deal with the body. They deal with erotic. They deal with global. They just poetry. They draw on Toni Morrison. They draw on dancing. It's just an amazing, and political engagement. But it's a good model actually of how all political theologies of any particular stripe can function. And they're very interdisciplinary. So I'm just a fly on the wall of women's theology, but I'm glad to be part of it in terms of a support. But again, to talk about political theology in the United States, I think that we would be very remiss if we don't talk about women's theology. Some have claimed that women's theology it's a holistic theology, in this context, political theology, is the most vibrant theology in the entire American Catholic religion. So that's Katie Cannon, who passed, she would make that very powerful, so we really miss her. But there are others, Tracy Floyd Thomas, who's at Vanderbilt, she's a former student, she can carry on that tradition, but everybody can. So again, political theology, to me, is a both-and person that's also academic. I invite all debates and interpretations of it, but I definitely agree with Professor Otten that let it all flow and let it all bubble. And for me, Black liberation theology is one particular case study of political theology, one that has a tradition, it's linked to biblical interpretation, and emerges out of the real political struggles of people of faith and basic decent humanistic citizens and non-citizens. No politics intended.
We have just a few minutes if there's a couple questions.
Do we have to RSVP for the conference, or is it?
It is free, but it actually would be appreciated. So it's on the website where you can register. So it would be great if you did. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, please.
I think maybe this is a simple question, but why is the word womanist used instead of feminist?
Right, this is a great question. Why is the womanist the term instead of feminist? Many of you know great thinkers, Mary, I think she's a great thinker, Mary Daly, Rosemary Ruther, our own Ann Carr. So you had Rosemary Ruther at Gary Northwestern, you had Ann Carr here in Chicago, you had, she's up at Yale. So they had one token woman at each school, basically. It's true, it's a fact. Not only token in the bad sense, it was a token. I thought it was awful. Unfortunately, a lot of them had to sacrifice their bodies as tokens, but they bridged and opened up a huge area of study. So, some of them have mentored me. I have to write a book on that one day. A lot of people don't know that. So there were, and they also helped some black women get into PhD programs, particularly Union Theological Seminary in New York. And so some of the founders of women's theology were Katie Cannon, who got her PhD at Union Seminary, Jackie Grant, who got her PhD at Union Seminary, Dolores Williams, who got her PhD at Union Seminary. Also, we'll stay with those three. There are others, but those three in particular. So when they came into the academy, they initially gravitated toward feminists. And these are their terms, not necessarily Hopkins' terms, but feminist theology is meant predominantly white academic women. Not in a bad way. That's their term, not my term. Although I will incorporate the footnote them. And so they also gravitated towards some of the black male theologians because, well, we seem to have some relation in terms of history of slavery and race and, the black church. But we also have some affinity with our white sisters too in feminist theology. So there's a part of black women who were emerging scholars in PhD programs who wanted to develop, theory, they wanted to develop method, they wanted to develop academy and community connections, they want to develop church and non-church, just a holistic approach of women's theologians. And so they work with these particular groups, but they felt that their full voices, their full bodies, their full presence could be full completely either camp, that is the black male theologians and feminist theologians. So they said, well, what is a way that we can express our own positive, fully embodied self with the divine? And I always emphasize that because I think sometimes in the academy, women's theology is attacked in such a degree, it misses that it emerges as a positive affirmation of self in relation to the divine. So anyway, they felt that they should call themselves initially black feminist theologians. So still work with everybody, but provide some space. And then in 1983, Alison Walker published a book called In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And in that book, which it's the second time she advances the notion of womanist. And so these black female feminist theologians, one of the co-founders, well, she's second generation, Kelly Brown Douglas will be at the conference November 2nd. She'll be there. So she was at me, and she's written about it. And she's a canon of the Episcopal Church, first black woman to be canonized in the Episcopal Church, ordained, I don't know if they ordained. Can't ask me, did.
Yes.
So she could go towards that. But it was an attempt to claim the voice, faith, and walk of a group of people who had a lot in common in relationship to work with these other groups. Because I'll be on the panel with Kevin and Douglas, so we work together. But they required this space. And again, in Search of Our Cigars, Alice Walker in 1983 advanced the four-part definition of womanist. And so a lot of them, Katie Cannon, Jackie Grant, and Dolores Williams, and others too, said, aha, that is the term. So they appropriated that term of womanist, Alice Walker, to further advance the self in relationship to community. Sure.
The conference against race November 7th, 8th, and 9th. But November 7th is the day after November 6th, which everyone here, I would imagine, is aware is Election Day. I'm really curious, what do you anticipate or how would you plan for, I mean, it's going to be kind of right on everybody's radar, the day of the conference. Anything you anticipate in that regard?
It's crossed my mind increasingly. So I think Jeff Stout is a very mature scholar. He was president of the AR and he just retired from Princeton. I may talk to him about that since he's giving the opening lecture, whether he would have space to kind of reflect on this. Because, yeah, I agree. Depending on the outcome, it can be really...
And I'm not even sure it depends on the outcome, because whatever the outcome, there will be something to say.
Yes, I mean, depending on the outcome, people may feel more rattled by it, and you know, depending on the outcome, some people may feel more firm. So it's just hard to tell and predict the mood of the audience of campus. But it's a concern, yes, given the divisions, it is really a concern.
What an opportunity, yeah. I thought you did it on purpose.
Oh,
I think it was on purpose.
Oh, and then come to the bank.
yes, that is, thank you, that's very possible. No, I should look at it that way. Yeah.
I actually think that's a good note to end on.
Okay.
So we can vote, come to lunch next week, come to the conference, and see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.